And now I want to introduce our guest speaker, Angelica Diggs with the Montclair History Center.
Good evening, everyone. I want to just go ahead and say I went and made sure I followed you on Facebook during the presentation talks. I'll do Instagram when I get back to my car. So we'll just get the presentation up tonight. I actually worked with the History Center for about 7 years. Previously was at another museum in Madison, and I've returned back as of this past fall. So I'm thrilled to be back. I grew up in the area. And as so many of you know, the history of Montclair and Glen Ridge are very intertwined within each other. And I'm actually really happy that the Glen Ridge Historical Society decided to pick the Rosedale Cemetery presentation for tonight. I'm a cemetery dweller. I might be preaching to the choir with this group. There's so much interesting history in these spaces. And also I find really fascinating some of the gravestone art that's on those stones. So I'm going to be taking us a bit through the oldest section of Rosedale Cemetery. Just curious, has anyone actually been to Rosedale Cemetery? Well, great. Okay, so then you understand, so most of you, the layout of the space. There's one section which is its earliest part. It's from its founding in 1840, and that's the area that I'm going to look into tonight and show you some of the highlights from some of the research we've done. We've started doing cemetery tours years ago in Rosedale Cemetery. We've expanded to additional sections. I mean, the cemetery is gorgeous. It's vast. There's so much to add to it over time. So if you haven't been on one of our in-person walking tours, please come join us. But I'll tell you a little about our favorite sections we go through tonight. Okay, great. Want to make sure that works for you. So to understand a bit about how cemeteries evolved, I'm just going to go through some of the time frames that lead up to what we see in Rosedale Cemetery, which is really part of that rural cemetery movement. So churchyard cemeteries, which actually that image on the right-hand side is that cemetery in orange. If you know, on Main Street and Scotland, that's where the original First Presbyterian Church was. So when you think churchyard cemetery, you can think something along these lines. This was very typical, people being buried along with their church, where they went. So again, pre-19th century. And the reason why this sort of shifted out was because that populations were expanding and exploding, and quite honestly, people ran out of space in their churchyard cemeteries. So that's essentially what leads to this founding and this movement of places outside the church that people could be buried at. And that's where that rural cemetery movement is coming out of. Interestingly, too, when you start to think about the population growing, it's also that increasingly health-conscious society. So think Trinity Church in Manhattan. People used to complain about the odor as you walked past. So having an idea of a place and a space properly set up and maintained to have families and burials happening is also part of that shift in movement going on at the time. So forward-thinking citizens start to shift from the churchyard and more towards an organized space run by a board of trustees, where they could be buried away from the church itself. So just to get another photo, there we go. So this is actually a photograph in Rosedale Cemetery, and I believe it's in the old section. I took it. I was probably standing somewhere. So the idea was to make it tidier when you think rural cemetery, but also involving grid system, serpentine roads, beautiful landscape, trees, park-like. And again, it evolves over time to feel a bit more organized, but the rural cemetery movement was meant to also not just be a place for those who are buried, but a place for people to visit and families and enjoy that landscape and space. And we start to see this right in the middle of the 1800s, and Rosedale Cemetery, originally actually called the Orange Cemetery Company, was part of that movement, and they were founded in 1840 and eventually changed the name to Rosedale that you see over time. So it really was meant to be a space for enjoyment. Rosedale even had a pond, and I'll show you an image as well. And this is just a fun fact. Apparently in Essex County, the cost for digging a grave was between $1.50 and $7 in the years 1828 and 1830. So that's right around the rural cemetery movement, and we start to again see the population booms. And even more so it will happen, obviously, as railroads are being established into our areas, and that was right around the 1850s and beyond. So what eventually also morphs out of the rural cemetery movement is lawn park. let me get an image there. This I just pulled up one online, very typical of what we might think of more modern or contemporary layout of cemetery spaces. So rural cemeteries were starting to feel haphazard to people. So this is more in the post-Civil War era this starts to happen. And because of development and trains post-Civil War, you have an even more mass fluctuation of people moving because of railroads. You have immigration overseas. So even more organization and structure needed to be introduced to these spaces. So a lot of the lawn park layout has to do with setup and maintenance, easier ways for access and finding, less secondary paths, more main streets, and more of that open pastoral lawn setting, literally as you see it there. So that's essentially where it morphs. And even when you go to Rosedale, the modern sections very much reflect that lawn park type of atmosphere. It's just mixed in with the rural cemetery. So it's actually a fun history lesson if you go through the different sections of Rosedale. You see the evolution of needs that comes for the communities out of those environments. So that's post-1865 and essentially takes us to what we think of for most cemeteries that we probably encounter today as we go through a bit. So I'm going to focus in a little more on the history of Rosedale itself. So as I showed in that first image, the main old burying ground over in orange was at that first Presbyterian church that we showed the image of before. So I was at Main Street in Scotland. Rosedale Cemetery was created in 1840, and quite a number of reinterments happened from the old burying ground to Rosedale, a few of which I'm going to tell you about because their stones and the people buried there predate the founding of Rosedale. So that's usually pretty obvious. And interestingly, too, I'm going to save this little tidbit for the end, some from also a cemetery in Montclair, which I'll talk about, that got reinterred there as well, and also towards Mount Hebron. So it wasn't actually uncommon. Think mass development. People are now taking what was once felt more quiet and rural residential zones, developing them into commercial spaces. We see it happen on our main roads. You might have had a church there or a burial site, and now you need a new place to put them. The old burying ground ran out of space. So when people got reinterred, often families made a decision to maybe move the whole family and keep them in one environment together. And we'll see an example or two of that as well. In 1844, Orange Cemetery changed officially to Rosedale. Rosedale, like many other places, offers cremation and has a columbarium today. When we actually do our in-person walking tours, we have a representative from Rosedale Cemetery join us from their board of trustees. I've learned so many facts about cemeteries just from engaging these individuals. And Rosedale, by the way, is a wonderful office and staff team. If you have family buried there, if you're doing research, they love to help. They love people stopping in the office. They have their own history walking tour guide. They truly encourage people learning about those who are buried there. So I just want to make sure I plug that for them as well. Later on in the 1860s, as many people are seeing the influx of populations, the more need for space, Rosedale expands its land. Excuse me. There we go. I love this map. So this is a 1906 plate. Many of you might be familiar with this in your own research you do in Glen Ridge. What I like here is Rosedale essentially fits this format today, but what 1906 is a good example of is post-railroad is how every bit of piece of land surrounding the cemetery is starting to get developed with residential. So again, the populations are starting to encroach on these really big spaces that were set up. And Rosedale did have a pond. It's not there anymore. It actually now houses a more modern lawn park-like cemetery section of the cemetery itself. So again, things evolve and space changes as needs evolve over time. Sorry, I clicked a little harder there. So this is actually an image of the columbarium inside Rosedale. It's absolutely gorgeous. So that's just a respectful place for people to have cremated remains of family. Interesting modern fact from Rosedale is, and probably all across the board, is more people are leaning towards cremations for their family versus the cost of burial plots. And also, religion might have dictated some of that a bit more in the past, habits change. Another fun fact of mine I love to share is that apparently in Europe, because of lack of space, you would have to lease a plot for your family to be buried. And after that lease is up, say maybe it's 15, 20 years, you would have to remove your family members from that site to then give that space to someone else to lease it. So in the United States, we have the luxury of land, right? So that we don't experience that here, or at least not yet. So it's just an interesting fact to think about when you go to other places, perhaps overseas or in Europe, that is a case and something that's very routine in people's habits and expectations of burial practices. I also just like to show this. If you've been in the old section of Rosedale, or you've seen this in other sites, if you ever see, rural, so in the middle of the 1800s, if you see something like this, it actually was an old receiving vault, or sometimes family mausoleums or vaults were built into a hill, but that will be pretty clearly labeled with a name and a door. I'm going to show an example of that as well. So these receiving vaults, when it's just fully bricked and it's clearly not a family's resting place, was actually because, think in winter when people passed, you did not have equipment and tools at this point to dig into the ground. So Rosedale confirmed that this was actually a holding place for families who passed in the winter months until they could get families into the ground. So it's just something visually to keep in mind when you go through these spaces. That's what you're actually seeing when the dating of the cemetery's founding goes to that certain period of time. When you get closer in the later 1800s, you probably wouldn't see that as much anymore for a cemetery founded was that point or thereafter. Now I'm going to start with a Reverend Asa Hillier. So every image or person I show is someone who is buried in the old section of Rosedale Cemetery. And quite interestingly, because of Rosedale's development, there's some modern, more modern or 20th century burials, although primarily what I'm showing is some of the oldest burials on site. So this Reverend Asa Hillier was actually one of the first buried in Rosedale. He was the pastor of, again, the First Presbyterian Church in Orange, so part of that old burying ground, over on Main Street and Scotland Road. He was the pastor there from 1801 to 1838. And like I said, most burials would have been at a church. Interesting, he was a reverend, and his was not. He actually died in 1840, but he was moved here to Rosedale, we confirmed with the cemetery office in 1841. So he must have been buried and then moved. Just to note the shape, the obelisk is one of the most common revival forms of cemetery stone styles that you see during this rural cemetery movement. Also urns, not urns that hold remains, decorative urns on top of gravestones. I mean, you could throw a rock and you'd hit an urn in Rosedale Cemetery. It's just oddly enough that half of, or most of what's on my presentation do not have urns, but truly that is the second most common decorative art feature in the 1800s at that time. And obelisks were really considered to be tasteful, uplifting lines, associated with ancient greatness, thinking about classical revival, Greek, and also having something taller and heavier. Now that you had transportation, you had access to get heavier material types and stones and transport that. So all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1800s, you have a boom for mass structures. And styles happening in the cemetery. And that's really because of railroads being available. So that also gives you an indication as well. So Reverend Asa Hillier, I don't have an image of him, but he was born in Massachusetts, attended Yale. He actually was a pastor over in Madison, not too far away. And then he eventually came here and was the minister at the Orange Church. This was his residence at the corner of Main and Hillier Streets that eventually was occupied by his son-in-law years later on. And what's interesting is we assume this was sort of a statement. Rural cemeteries, when Reverend Asa Hillier was buried, were new. And he was a pastor at the church that probably had a full churchyard. And it's almost indicating, saying it's okay to be buried away from your church site. Or at least that's how we interpret it. So him and his family were part of that new movement to be buried away from the churchyard. So it's an interesting example of setting that tone for society at the time. So this is the Pearson family plot. So this is an example on the left side here of where you could see a family mausoleum or vault essentially built into a hill. You won't really typically see that anymore. This is one of very few in Rosedale Cemetery, just because of space and convenience and functionality. It's probably not ideal. So this is actually of the Pearson family, which is a very common name throughout areas here in Montclair, Orange, or Glen Ridge. And this is of a Dr. Matthias Pearson and Phoebe Pearson. They also predate Rosedale. So they too were yet again buried at that old burying ground and were reinterred later on. Between that vault and, I'm going to show another image in a moment, but if you look up on the hill, there's essentially a scattering of graves really sitting at odd directions comparatively to each other, as well as on the right side, the close-up, you can see some modern ones sort of mixed in, and I apologize I don't have a better photo of that. That's because this family, the Pearsons, were adding different stones over time as more people were getting buried there. So it's very disjointed, and it's not that formality of like that lawn park cemetery movement we think of. And actually there's over 26 total Pearsons buried in this space, including some in that vault. And a number of which came from the old burying ground and were reinterred here as a family, and then more were added over time. So a bit about the Pearsons. They lived in the Oranges and were a part of the Orange Mountain Society. Matthias was a doctor. So Phoebe, also his wife, who is buried here, came from a prominent family line, descendant of Charlemagne. So they were pretty distinguished in this area. And I don't know, has anyone actually been to the Montclair History Center where the Crane House is? Some of us. So our Israel Crane married the daughter of Phoebe and Dr. Matthias. So her name was Fanny Pearson. So they probably ran in similar social circles. They met, and yet their family is buried here. But that ties to the family's lineage in Orange and being in that old burying ground church space, as you see here. I do like to point out the color of these older graves. This is not common to the rural cemetery movement. If you see this in a cemetery that feels more contemporary or was founded in the middle of the 1800s onward, this is again an indication that this was a reinterment. So this is a sandstone style, more typical of late 1700s, early 1800s. They almost all look the same. They have that door portal shape, so, a door walking through to the next part of your life into passing, and has some pretty typical things set on it in memory of. I mean, if you go to that old burying ground in Orange, almost every single stone is identical with just slightly different phrasing or naming, and it's that sandstone was locally available. So again, this was pre-railroad. You used what you had available to memorialize your family at the time. So it's just something to keep in mind. And again, these two, although you don't see a lot of surrounding, are sitting very oddly next to other modern stones. So, and again, this indications that things were just added over time and there really wasn't a formal type of grid system set up to deal with the additions of new family members in that space. Also buried in the Pearsons is a woman named Ruth Ogden Pearson. Fascinating woman. She was the daughter who's listed on here of Isaac and also Flora. She was born in China in 1885, and Isaac was a minister and a missionary, so that makes sense. She is noted as being a bacteriologist, and which is unusual for a woman of her time, and that's in the early 1900s. She never married. She attended Wellesley College. She also went to Rhode Island, was part of the Rhode Island Board State of Health. She also then attended MIT in 1910. She was the director of the Red Cross Laboratory in Ohio, so well-traveled, well-educated. And eventually she ends up being a bacteriologist in East Orange in 1930 and working for the City Board of Health in Orange, and passes not too long after in 1943. So a really interesting, established woman. Would love to know more about her in time. She was also a member of the American Public Health Academy, and she's buried with her parents and her brother in that space that you see there. This one is also right next door to the others. What drew us to this, and some people may not realize the picture might be a little hard, it's actually this bluish color of this gravestone. So visually, this one pops in a space of others that sort of blend. So the stone itself is actually called white bronze, it's made of zinc. So this grave, and again, has that obelisk type shape, but the zinc was something that was manufactured up in Connecticut. So if you go to Connecticut, if you drive by and you see some of the grave sites, you'll see that blue stone color everywhere. You see it sporadically in grave sites here in New Jersey. So it's very unusual, and I'm hopefully going to play something for you in a minute. Because it's actually hollow on the inside, so it's that metal. It deceives you a little bit when you see it in person. And what's also interesting about Reverend Thomas Smith is he had some pretty detailed information about him. He had 2 wives. One we believe passed in childbirth. He married again, as well as some additional children buried there. He put some very detailed things about where their family was from, where they died. Really helpful for researchers like ourselves trying to uncover information. Pretty smart. And I just want to go through here. I also want to point out on that stone are some really great symbolism. So something you see in the rural cemetery movement is just a boom of how can we best represent our family members, the recently deceased, in something that will honor them. So these are some very common symbols you might see on stones at this time. So wheat means the divine harvest. Man leaning on the cross is an unwavering faith. Usually when there's an open book, it means a passage of one existence into another. And the rosebud could mean things like wisdom and love. But if you notice on the bottom right, it's cut off. So usually a rosebud cut short means a life cut short. And we do know, or any type of bud leaf cut, doesn't have to be rose. We do know that there was a baby who had passed, who was buried in the site, so I'm assuming that represents that young child. So if you actually notice that, usually cut bud leaves are for young children or often women as well. That's pretty typical symbol for that at that time. Now, I'm going to see if this works for us. Hold on. This is just to get a sense of the sound. I'm not encouraging knocking on stones at graves, but, you know, Rosedale encourages us to explore. So we went ahead and did this. Let's see if the sound will kick up for us. It's low. There you go. You get the idea. So completely hollow. And like I said, it tricks you. At first you think it's stone, but it truly is that zinc. But now you know if you do see that blue hue, what that means. Again, not super popular by us, but it stands out in a large field in that crowd. The Williams family is another stone over in the old section. What we've noticed first when we saw it is the long list of names. And often very much some young passings and deaths. What we kind of made some assumptions about, because there were a lot who were young or who only survived to maybe a lower adulthood, there were a few epidemics at the time. There was cholera between 1834 to 1835, the 1857 to 1858 flu. So we're assuming that the Williams family maybe felt those effects. That nice crest that's displayed is actually the Lowell family crest, which it stands for, what's written there with the Latin is know your opportunity. And they believe their opportunity was here in this new world. So the Lowell family is known from New England, both intellectual and commercial achievements. They originally arrived in Boston. And this family came and eventually moved here. The Lowells, this family crest, when we dug around a little bit, among them were people like Tennessee Williams, Herman Melville, T.S. Eliot. So this family was pretty proud to put that crest on their stone there and that beautiful Celtic cross that we can see there as well. This family in particular doesn't seem to be particularly that affluent. There wasn't really too much in the research. But again, they were happy to have that crest represent the family lineage that they're coming from for that day. This George Sherwood, so I'm going to mention a little bit about the stone here. What actually is more interesting, not that George Sherwood's not interesting, is the stone carver. So this is a close-up, although it's a bit hard to read. It appears on the bottom of that stone there. So the stone maker was Duncombe and Company in Newark. And stone carvers, usually you have to have a good eye. The stone has to not be deteriorated. It might be usually somewhere indiscreet, and you won't notice it quite a few times in first passing. We were attracted to this because of the beautiful artistry and the weeping willows on the top, but it is very much so at the bottom, and you have to pay attention to find it. So Duncombe and Company, they were known as the czar of the 19th century Newark tombstone carving industry. They were nicknamed Czar T. Duncombe. It was in operation around 1839, so right around when Rosedale opened up, and it was over on Market Street. They were advertising as the manufacturers of marble monuments and tombs of every description that were listed. So this was a known company you could go and get your stone materials from. So Duncombe signed many examples of his work, from small gravestones to large monuments, as we can see here. So this is a smaller stone that he signed and just noted his work on it. He initially actually operated out of Connecticut. He was acting as a supplier for someone in North Carolina who was also a cabinet maker and undertaker, so jack of all trades. And eventually in 1840 he comes up to Newark and is still apparently shipping gravestones to North Carolina, so he really had established a business through his ties in the South there. By the early 1850s, Duncombe eventually moves his operation from Newark and ends up leaving New Jersey and his craft at that point. But he did make a mark on quite a number of small and large graves, and here's one that is an example in Rosedale. Winthrop, Dodd, Mitchell. What we like to show about this is the unusual stone type in particular. So we focus on the stone here. It's a different style of what's called a hip sarcophagus. That you can see, and the hip is essentially what's sort of mimicking almost that house-like roof shape. So if you are an architect, which I think there's a few here this evening, it's sort of implying that feature and that style. For most, I think, no, there is no person buried within the tomb itself. It's still underground. This is a stylistic grave, just mimicking, obviously, the impression of what a body would be. So it's truly representing like a low-slung house, and that cross is truly just a style feature. And sarcophagus, there's maybe, or sarcophagi, there's a few in Rosedale. It's not super popular, but there are a few that you'll come across, and this one obviously stood out to us for its shape and type there. When it comes to the Mitchell family, they were just New Jersey rooted and born family, one of whom is a Dodd. That's a very common name in these areas. And they descend what's known as the Peck family, which is also associated with the Oranges. So again, just a family from the area, but nothing too noteworthy. It's truly the style that drew us to it. This stone, again, another obelisk, so that's going to come up a few times today, we'd like to talk about. So this is for Captain Samuel Dodd. He was a Civil War Union Army officer who died during the war in 1863. So he was commissioned as the captain and commander of Company H-26 New Jersey Volunteer Infantry. So he led his troops through the December 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg and the May 1863 Battle of Chancellorsville. So on July 5th, 1863, he led a portion of his men in conjunction with troops from Vermont across a river at Franklin's Crossing. The action was successful in capturing a number of rebel soldiers that he led and the clearing of some rifle pits, but in ensuing return, Captain Dodd was mortally wounded and died the next day as part of battle. So this really commemorates him. And what's hard to see is there's actually some oak leaves. That's meant to be a very powerful, a symbol of strength and power. So that is really was picked intentionally to represent this person who was fighting in the war at the time. So this photograph on the right just happens to be a wonderful coincidence. We found this actually in the Montclair History Center archives when we were doing this research. So this is a photograph of the Sons of the Civil War veterans. I'm guessing it's late 19th century. I unfortunately don't have an exact date of when this gathering occurred. Visiting the grave of Captain Samuel Dodd in Rosedale Cemetery. So pretty amazing, and that's a photograph I found online of Captain Samuel Dodd as well. So really neat. It's a great gravestone to go and check out. So Lowell Mason, I want to share a little bit about. So that next two people are musicians and really known as being founders with the Boston Music Academy. So Lowell Mason was an individual born in Massachusetts. So he is known as the founder of the American School Music Education and co-founder of the Boston Academy of Music. He was a religious musical composer, and he was a leading figure and a writer of church music, having composed over 1,600 hymns, including the well-known Near My God to Thee, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and Joy to the World is a pretty popular one that most people know. He was also credited with setting music to the nursery rhyme Mary Had a Little Lamb. So that's a fun fact. This is actually a great example on the left of a large family plot. And what you can see here are these posts. This is actually essentially a step inviting you to come in And then on these posts, there's actually what's left, not on all parts, would have been iron railings surrounding it and separating it from everything else around it. There's a lot of family members and other relatives buried in that plot. And the center monument, I guess I'll call it, or tombstone, is the Mason family, and then on each side just describes some of the people who are there. I was gonna play the near to my God to thee as an example, but you know what? I think because we switched my PowerPoint, that's okay. If you know Mary Had a Little Lamb, at least gives you an idea of who he was, or Joy to the World, so that's all right. That's a photograph or a sketching of him. What is interesting is that on one of the sides of the stone, there clearly was something else there that was inserted. That could be as simply as it just fell off, but it goes to show you how customizable certain monuments or stones were, and that would not have been uncommon. You know, you wanted to affix things as you needed and be able to. I don't think there's anything too mysterious about it. That probably just at some point in time, whatever that was fell off and is lost now to the world. So we do not know what it said on that side. But if you see it, I feel like it's not alarming. It just means time has gotten the best of some of these structures, and there's no current family or descendants looking after some of these spaces. Buried in the same plot, George James Webb, not related to the Masons, although I think his child married one of his child, but they co-founded the Boston School of Music together, so they were professional friends. So they really worked together all of their lives. So he was also a composer and a hymn writer. He was born in actually England, emigrated to Boston, where he played the organ at the Old South Church for almost 40 years, and then they eventually founded the Boston Academy of Music. So they clearly met in a professional setting and worked together and became lifelong friends. So he is known for certain works such as Prelude in Ebb and Postlude in A, and 'Tis Dawn the Lark is Singing. So those I don't know myself. Again, I don't think that clip's going to work, but that's all right. On that right-hand side is just a photograph of him and his wife and daughter there pictured. So this is an interesting story I'd like to read for you and share. He apparently... he repurposed the hymn, Stand Up for Jesus. That was actually what I was going to play. And if you're not familiar with it, that's okay, because what's interesting is this little tidbit of where the hymn Stand Up for Jesus came from. So apparently in 1858, shortly after preaching at a hugely successful mission in Philadelphia, abolitionist Dudley Atkins Tying visited a barn on his farm. So this is a whole different person, not related to them. Stretching out to pat a mule that was working a machine shelling corn, his sleeve caught this man and essentially ripped off his arm. Hours later, he was discovered and passed. I'll leave out the graphic detail. And so in his last moments, he apparently whispered to one of his assistants, who was a man named George Duffield, tell them to stand up to Jesus. So Duffield apparently went sadly home and then wrote this hymn as a tribute to this man, which he read out as part of his next sermon. And it was printed in a Sunday school newspaper and soon caught on to the point that it was sung on both sides during the Civil War. So that's just a fun fact of where the stand up to Jesus hymn essentially morphs out of a very graphic and sad story. But just to share that bit. Some musical people buried on that section of Rosedale as well. Anthony Thompson, this one actually took us a bit of time to fully discover. So Anthony Thompson was actually born in 1798, enslaved to a John Duryea in Somerset County, New Jersey. So Duryea was a pastor in the local Dutch Reformed Church. This is very clearly a modern stone type, so there was not a stone, or if there was, it was either really poorly damaged or something to the extent that then a new one was placed in to honor Anthony Thompson. So it just does a little bit of the trick of the eye, but then you see the date on there because that's a new granite type material. So Anthony and his mother, a little bit of background is that they were sold when he was just 1 year old to a David Still, who is in Somerset County. And he kept them about 1 year before selling to somebody else, a Samuel Ward, who lived right outside of the cemetery area, actually, on a 60 to 70 acre farm. When Samuel died in 1822, he manumitted Anthony and valued him at $200. He did not set free his mother, who was named Dinah. Dinah actually is a name erasure term. Very often you hear or see names listed as Dinah for female enslaved individuals, but it very often was not their name. It was used as a subterm. So she was 60 and considered unable to support his mother. So she would also be sold at that point in time. So Anthony actually paid for her freedom, or purchased her, and together they lived in West Orange until she passed away sometime between 1840 and 1850. He eventually went to work for the Williams family in West Orange, and he was able to purchase his own home. And he married a woman named Priscilla Conover, and when she died, he remarried to a woman named Harriet as well. So he lived a very long life, and has an uplifting story of what he was able to accomplish for himself and his family to not be enslaved, and to gain his freedom at that point. And it was apparently known for being really well respected in the community and a skilled person as well. And he is identified on census data as primarily being a farm laborer and working for people nearby. We learned of Anthony because there was an article, that's the New York Times article, that was actually published in the 1800s that interviewed Anthony Thompson at the time, as well as another woman named Betsy. And they were the two last living people who were enslaved in New Jersey and Essex County. And they gave these accounts of what it was, the sadness and the cruelty involved of being enslaved, and essentially how they worked their way to gaining their own freedom and establishing their lives here in the community. And interestingly, Anthony even mentions in this article that everybody went to the first church in Orange. So again, that first Presbyterian church comes back into play where that old burying ground is. And he notes that people who were enslaved were boxed up in one corner, like horses in a stall. And in the new first church, then enslaved had a place in the gallery. So, you know, it's also important we recognize and acknowledge that New Jersey had a big part in enslaving thousands upon thousands of individuals, and was the last northern state in New Jersey to abolish slavery because of the economic ties to the South. So, we're honored when we get to talk about Anthony Thompson when we go through and can talk about that part of history. We didn't even realize that he was buried there until we happened to stumble across it at a point in time and then confirm this is in fact the individual we saw in these articles that we had read the narratives of. So it's great to be able to share that. Okay, Earl Williams. This is a more modern one. So Earl Williams, and I'll explain in a minute while I'm jumping. This is again where you see the Lawn Park Cemetery start to encroach onto that older part of the cemetery. He's just a cool person to mention, so I know I'm jumping from 1800s to 20th century now for us. So he was born in 1848. So Earl Craig Williams was born in Newark, raised in East Orange, and then eventually comes and lives in Montclair. He was an exceptional athlete at Montclair High School, and as you can see, goes on to professionally play in a variety of settings, and particularly baseball. His family was very much involved with Montclair, as well as having Montclair City Council seats. He played all sorts of sports, but chose baseball, and then he eventually was drafted to the Milwaukee Braves in the first round of the 1965 Major League Baseball Legion draft, which is pretty neat. So he marked his Major League debut 4 years after the franchise's relocation to Atlanta. So after retiring from baseball, Earl Williams actually worked as a supervisor for a company which produced machinery parts in New Jersey. And sadly, he passed from complications from leukemia at a fairly younger age than most. What actually made us come across him and realize he was here, so on the bottom right, you're essentially looking at nothing but like a cement line. These are what are called pre-pad foundations, which is part of the new cemetery way of being able to have better maintenance and care and ensure that stones don't move, or say if you have removal equipment coming through or you're taking care with like lawnmowers and property, that things, the grave are really sturdy and formed into the ground in a way that they can be maintained. Earl Williams doesn't have a gravestone. It is unmarked. So we knew he was buried here, but we obviously couldn't find it. So Rosedale Cemetery came to help us and explained that he was in a part of the pre-pad foundation area, and that's just marking where he is buried today. But And it's not the first time. There's actually another athlete, Althea Gibson, who was very profound in tennis, also had an unmarked grave for so long at Rosedale Cemetery, and eventually actually just had one put in recently. Moving on, so near also the older section of Rosedale, I really like to point this area out too. So this is a section which is honored by the Chinese Charitable Benevolent Association. This is an organization that promotes the well-being of Chinese American individuals. So it's interesting because when you go through this area, there actually are what are these called almost like burn bins set up, because part of the tradition of Chinese families for grieving families is that they burn joss paper and other objects known as like ghost money or little miniatures of clothing or nostalgic pieces, so that the idea is to take those items with you into the afterlife. So the process of burning it allows it to go with the family member. So the Rosedale Cemetery honors that tradition and has certain dates and times family can come and practice that art of the burning. And also, as you can see on top, common to other cultures as well is the bringing of rocks and memorializing family as a way of saying I visited. So that's also common. And right within that old section of Rosedale. So it's really interesting to see. And you can see the remnants of the joss paper and some things also placed on the grave sites as well. Right across from the Chinese Charitable Benevolent Association is a very unusual lineup of old gravestones. So this I like to point out because when you see something like this, you know that it was not here in the first place. So these were stones that were actually this whole lineup, and I'll go a close-up on a few in a minute. They were removed from the Second Presbyterian Church in Newark, which is pictured on the right-hand side. So again, reinterments, it was not so unusual, it was happening. And again, those stone types, very much that door and portal, whether it was sandstone or that limestone, which actually is super difficult to read because it deteriorates so fast outside. That was also a common earlier stone type. They're just all lined up in this space. What I like about these stones is they kind of tell us about the evolution of death's head. So I'm jumping a little bit here. So again, if you think about the old burying ground in Orange, you start to see what's pictured on the right-hand side as you get towards the middle of the 1800s, which is essentially almost like this cherub-like feature, which to me, it has such a sad face on it, I find interesting. And you start to see things that say like in memory of. Prior to this, this is not at Rosedale, but an example of this evolution of death's head is more of that skull or crossbone-like type of structure, and saying that here lies the body of. So with the evolution of cemeteries also came the evolution of how people are memorialized in terms of the wording we use, the depictions from something that feels very daunting and fearful to something a little bit lighter and more human-like in form. And you start to see that. So that's pretty interesting. And that vacant face that you see on the right eventually would shift to having even more human-like features and carving and interpretation. And eventually you just see them stop altogether. That would not be something common in Rosedale. If you see anything like that on the right, you know it came from an earlier cemetery and was eventually moved there. People sort of morphed away from that cherub-like to maybe instead, I guess the alternative would be angel-type statuary, to then just using symbolic motifs instead on gravestones. I think you can tell I'm a bit fascinated with the evolution of the design in itself as the people. I think it's pretty neat. These are just some close-ups of a few of the oldest. This is the limestone, which deteriorates fast. So if we're thinking symbols, so the one in the middle, there's that cut bud leaf, so a child or a young woman. Willow tree usually means mortality and mourning, and flames also might have been common at the time, which means everlasting life as well. So you'll see those in those depictions. It's hard to read some of these as well. I wanted to mention this, so I have to because I work for the Montclair History Center. So if we've all visited Church Street, do we know where the Starbucks is on Church Street? That was actually a cemetery. So on Church Street, there was a different Presbyterian church that before that area was commercialized and saw development, there was quite a bit of property that was either residential or had to do with the Presbyterian church that was there at the time. So in Montclair, you can see here, this is an 1865 map. It says Montclair Cemetery. So those people were eventually brought up and reinterred elsewhere. In one of the history books we have in our archives, I want to read this for you. People, I think, really had a sense of humor at the time. So it says in 1876 and 1877, the old graveyard, which was on Church Street, between what is now Bradford Place, Trinity Street, and the Crescent, was all dug up, and the bodies were moved to Rosedale Cemetery. There was one case of an old Mr. Munn who had been buried for many years. And upon digging up his grave, it is said that his body was found to be petrified with the exception of one leg and the lower jaw, which was missing. It is said they stood him up on the 1 foot and that a great many people went to see him like that. I think people must have had a sense of humor. Would we do that today? No, but I guess we can appreciate looking at things lightly, right? Or making the best of a situation. But now whenever you visit Starbucks on Church Street, please know that you're going where Mr. Munn was propped up with one leg. So, this I love. This is actually, the picture isn't doing it justice. This is one of my favorite grave sites in the old cemetery. And this is architect Charles Fallon McKim, who is very well known throughout this area. The way his stone on this picture here, it actually is inviting you to step up and enter this structural space. So clearly an architect designed this idea of this grave. It is a family plot, so it's a play on a family plot with inviting you to come and be within the space and to enjoy it. Again, because people saw cemeteries, particularly at this time, as spaces where family were going to come and visit and be part of that space. Charles Fallon McKim was an architect, as we know. Some of his best-known works were things like the Morgan Library, the University Club of the New York Building, the New York Penn Station that was taken down in 1964, and he died a year before that was opened. He also designed the Newport Casino in Rhode Island and the Boston Public Library. So he obviously established his life in this community, and he's buried there along with his family, amongst others. And again, it's truly beautiful. It even involves some shrubbery in it, clearly with the intention of a nod to come and enjoy spaces, as an architect would say, these are spaces I want people to design and people to enjoy. So mimicking those feelings as well. Nearby to him, I'm sorry, I forgot this was here. So Charles Fallon McKim designed, was a home on South Fullerton Avenue in Montclair. It was actually on a recent walking tour I did. It was something that was actually repurposed into what's now condos from a new development at the time, but you can see what's remaining of the house on this right side of the structure itself. So while he's known for doing a lot of famous works in bigger cities, he also did some residential work right here in our own area. So that's just fun to see. So near him is another man named John George Seabury. This is more of the typical mausoleum style you would see in Rosedale. That one example I showed at the beginning with it basically in the hill was probably one of the first attempts, after reinterring some of the family members here. This is a great example of a Greek revival mausoleum. So again, just drawing on architectural features to showcase and invite into the space. So John comes from a very prominent family. He had planned to be a physician, but the Civil War essentially interrupted those plans. So he served in private company, C-12th in New York, the Volunteer Infantry. And after the war, he actually founded Seabury and Johnson Pharmaceutical Company with Robert Wood Johnson. So they manufactured medical plasters and surgical dressings. Seabury became president, and Johnson was the corporate secretary and sales manager. And eventually, I do have another picture. As their business grew, it moved from South Brooklyn and then to East Orange. So on the right is actually a photograph inside of one of those East Orange manufacturing facilities. You can still visit the old Seabury and Johnson buildings at Glenwood Avenue. It's known as Manufacturers Village, and that's what you see on the left-hand side is that contemporary photo. So Seabury and Johnson, they were pretty well-respected medical business, and they were known for its quality of medicated plasters. Johnson apparently hires his brothers later in time. And then over a number of years, a lot of just disagreements and arguing and fighting occurs. So his two brothers eventually left and formed their own business. And then Robert Wood Johnson left Seabury, and then Johnson went on to form his own company with his brothers, which would eventually be known as Johnson & Johnson. So, which today. So Johnson & Johnson, connected to the Seabury family, in the same type of business, eventually forms their own. So he is buried here along with his family. Okay. Now, when we were walking through an old section, we came across this modern stone. And if you can't see it, I'm going to read it for you. It says, Vic and Al, rockin' was their business. Rest in peace. Of course, we were fascinated. And what you see on the back is on the right. So we asked Netflix, I almost just gave it. We asked Rosedale, and we said, can you tell us what this is about? And she says, sure. It actually was someone brought this in to film a Netflix series. So sometimes things can trick you. This was a prop stone that what they did, and apparently the show never took off. Because we're like, what's the show? Tell us. And then they couldn't. So what's blurred on the back, it's actually scuffed out on purpose. It was probably just a stone they got on sale that maybe was a goof up or something a family didn't want. They carved what they needed on the side for the Netflix family and propped it, and it's just been left there. It takes up space. It adds for a really great story during tours. So if you ever see something unusual, ask the cemetery office. You never know what you're going to find out. So we just thought that was fun because we wanted to look into who these people were, and we found out it was just for a TV show. I have to put in James and Phoebe Crane, related to the Crane House over at the Montclair History Center. And Phoebe is that person who descends from the first family Pearson plot I told you about. So Dr. Matthias, so Dr. Matthias and Phoebe, then their daughter Fanny marries Israel Crane. James is the son of Fanny and Israel, and he marries, again, another woman named Phoebe. This is actually a photograph of them, maybe 1840s, probably right around the time Rosedale Cemetery opened up. But we just like to point it out. There's nothing too notable about the stone other than the fact that we just found descendants of one of our museums who are buried there. And that's the Crane House. If you haven't been there before, please come visit us. George Wilson Ferguson. Actually, you know what, I take back, this is sort of a mausoleum built into a hill, but with a lot more structural intention there than that small hill vault you saw earlier. So what's actually noted above George Wilson mausoleum here is he was noted as being for 34 years the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Ossining, New York. And the cross was actually taken and placed here by the vestry in loving memory of his service. And you can see that cross is pictured up there on the top itself. So the parish itself was founded in 1868, originally met in a basement, essentially. And then the Union veterans from the village of Sing Sing, and then the parish became a tenant in the original wooden structure of the First Presbyterian Church, then located at the present site of South Highland Avenue. So he did marry. He married a woman named Helen Jackson, who was born in New Jersey, so that might explain why he's buried